Boardroom Bound, episode 181, the marketplace that connects startups with board leaders, with Matt Blumberg.
If you think of your board as a team, and you treat the team the way you treat your leadership team, right, where you have to tend that team like a garden, right? You have to make sure the right people earn it, the wrong people get out of it. You have to worry about the social dynamic. You have to make sure that the team is building great connections in and across itself. The team is building connections to the rest of the company. The team is building connections outside the company within the industry. You just start to behave differently about how you run it, how you spend time with it, and what kinds of things you ask of it.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's show, we're speaking with Matt Blumberg, and he is the co-founder and CEO of Bolster, which is an on-demand executive talent marketplace, both for people that want to be in the C-suite and on the boards, connecting people, especially people that might not have the right network to get into the board, to bring the skill set they have to boards. But he's also an author of books like The Startup CEO, The Startup CXO, and as the soon coming out book, Startup Boards, coming out June 15th. And we're going to hear a great preview of that book today. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about board director education and certification. Want to join your first board or looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Education and Certification course. Get both the modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated with one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency Designation upon course completion, available in one-on-one, group, or on-demand registration options. You can learn more at bit.ly, that's bit.ly/IBDC-D. So bit.ly/IBDC-D. And now, let's jump into the show. Matt Blumberg, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, for me, this is a real collection of multiple reasons we should have you on the show, right? So we've got your soon-to-be upcoming book, The Startup Boards, that is coming out. That is highly relevant to our audience. What you're doing at Bolster is incredibly important in the world as well and relevant to our audience. There's a lot of different things we're going to touch on here today, but I get excited. So before I launch into these, let me step back. You also bring a lot of board experience yourself to this conversation. I'm sure part of that is why Bolster started, but let's give an overview of your career before we jump into the details of the show today.
Yeah, sure. My career, I started out of college with a couple quick jobs in management consulting and as an associate in venture capital. I spent about 4 or 5 years during Internet 1.0, this sort of .com era, 95, 6, 7, 8, 9, running an Internet business and building an Internet business called Moviefone. That was actually inside of an existing company, Moviefone 777 Film, that was a movie guide and ticketing service. I started a company in 1999 after we sold Moviefone to AOL. I started a company called ReturnPath in the email marketing and analytics space. I built and ran and scaled that with an amazing team for 20 years. We sold that company in 2019. And then I started Bolster, my current company, with a group of my colleagues from ReturnPath in 2020. So we're now 2 years in on that. So that's the quick overview. Along the way, I have served on lots of boards, and I've chaired a number of them, and they've been lots of different types of boards. So private company, public company, nonprofit, trade association, community boards, education institution boards. So I think I've been on about a dozen boards and probably chaired about half of them. So that is my quick background.
Now, by the way, anyone who was paying close attention there would have probably picked up on the potential Seinfeld reference of the 777 film. I remember Kramer has 777 Filk as his phone number, and he does a terrible job answering people's queries about movies when they're calling. It's just a fun back in the day before the internet, what you might have actually had to do to look it up in the newspaper.
Good for you on picking up the Seinfeld reference.
I don't get to talk about that often on the show, so I got to make sure we sneak it in where we can. Well, if we get back to something more serious, Bolster is an incredible organization. I mean that in all sincerity, and I want people to know about it today. The world has changed a lot in the last few years, and not just because of COVID, but we've seen a lot of different tragedies like George Floyd and other things like that. And it's really brought to the forefront the fact that there is a lot of inequality in the world. But from the positive side of it, we mean that every organization, whether you're the CEO or the chairman of the board, you're looking for the right people to put around the table. And it shouldn't be just because they have the right network, right? They have the right skill set, the right attitude, the right approach. And you guys are doing a wonderful job helping bridge the gaps that exist in that space. So tell us more about the organization and how it came about, because it's a wonderful story.
Yeah, so Bolster, as I mentioned, was started by a group of 8 of us who had worked together at Return Path for a number of years. So we have 8 co-founders, and Return Path was a enterprise software business in email marketing and analytics, and has nothing to do with what we do at Bolster. But our team had spent a lot of time over the course of 20 years being, I think, obsessive about our culture, leadership development, management training, and really creating a world-class organization. We spent a lot of time and energy studying those things, doing those things in-house, and increasingly, as the company got larger and larger, at mentoring other companies, earlier stage startups, about how to scale and how to scale different aspects of their business. So after we sold Return Path, and a group of us were trying to figure out a business we wanted to start, that's sort of the topic area that we gravitated to. And how do we help other organizations do some of those things that we felt like we stumbled around and made a lot of mistakes in and learned over the years? And we landed on the business that is now called Bolster. So Bolster's mission is to help founders and CEOs of startups and of growth stage companies be more successful at scaling up their leadership teams, at scaling up their CEOs as leaders, and as scaling up their boards. And what we've built at Bolster, or what we're building at Bolster, is a marketplace for executive talent to connect senior executives, a lot of experienced, sort of C-level executives across all functional roles, connect those executives to the CEOs and founders and heads of HR of early stage companies. So in the Bolster marketplace, if you're a founder or a CEO, you can come in and find an executive to do any type of job for you, whether it's a project, a 30-minute free consultation, a part-time job, a full-time executive job, or an advisory or coach or board of directors role. So it's a marketplace. It connects the buyer and the seller, and the buyer is the founder or CEO. The seller is the executive.
The sort of simple economist in me loves the buyer and seller idea, and I'm sure for many people that seems anathema the way we describe human beings. But in many ways, that's what it is. You're connecting different people, and clearly the executive is probably the main driver because so many more opportunities. But I know you've helped place dozens of directors of private and public companies, and it must be really exciting to help people realize, like, we're breaking that traditional model of you had to have gone to this country club or just known these people, and to be able to put the right person at the right table must be really rewarding. And I'm sure some of the stories coming back, just opening the doors for someone with that experience that they've tried so hard to find, must be really fulfilling.
It is, absolutely. So again, Bolster is only 2 years old. We've probably done about 35 or 40 board searches, and including placing 3 independent directors on our own board. So we definitely serve ourselves as a client, and it's been a very good experience and a very good learning experience. We have successfully placed a very large number of female directors, people of color, most of whom have never been on a board before. And we've certainly had a lot of focus on that and a lot of interest in that from the market. And it's been a good learning, though, about sort of how to go about the process of helping companies select a board member. Most founders and CEOs have either never done that before, or they've done it once or twice. Where even senior executives, founders don't hire a ton of them, but they've hired more than a handful. Hiring a board member is a very unusual and quirky thing. So we end up spending a lot of time coaching our clients about how to go through that process, helping them identify what they're looking for in a board member, helping them figure out what an interview process looks like, helping them figure out how to compensate the board member, helping them figure out how to onboard the board member, and sort of lots of things like that.
And in many ways, I'm sure that draws upon your own experience that we talked about briefly before, about being on lots of different types of boards and having that background experience. And I know there's an art to building and in managing a board, and I'm sure some of this will tie into the book. And maybe let's start with a little bit of explanation of the book, and then we'll dive into some of this a bit more. So tell us about coming out June 15th. You've got your book, Startup Boards, which is really number 3 in a series, right? So maybe we'd start with the introduction to the series.
Yeah, absolutely. So the 3 books are Startup CEO, Startup CXO, and Startup Boards. Startup CEO is a book that I wrote in 2013, and I did a second edition in 2020. And it is a handbook for the first-time CEO about how to be a CEO. It's not a front-to-back read, although you can read it that way. It's called a field guide, and it's about 60 or 70 chapters of how to do very specific things. So it's meant for a CEO to kind of have on their desk, dog-ear the pages, and periodically open it up if they're not sure how to do something. How to run a board meeting, how to do a pitch deck, how to hire someone, how to fire someone, how to work with an executive assistant, how to work with a coach. So 60 or 70 topics like that. Startup CXO is a book that I wrote alongside of my team over the last couple of years, and it came out in 2021. Startup CXO is kind of the anatomy of an executive team of a startup. So it's 20 chapters on how to be a startup CFO, written by a career startup CFO, my colleague Jack. It's 20 chapters about how to run sales at a startup, written by my colleague Anita. 20 chapters about how to be a startup product leader, startup head of HR. So it's kind of a book of books, and also a great resource, not just for a functional leader at a startup, but for CEOs who've never had to hire or manage those different executives before. And also, I think, useful for aspiring leaders inside of a company. If you're a junior marketing person, what do you need to do to become a senior marketing person? So it's sort of it takes the executive roles and breaks them down. And then Startup Boards, which is coming out in June, is a book that I've co-authored with Brad Feld and Mahendra Ramsangani, both of whom are venture capitalists. And it is also a field guide, so it's a number of small chapters about how to do different elements of the job. It's a field guide to building and leading effective boards. So I'm very excited about the book coming out. I think it's going to be really additive to founders and CEOs and to aspiring board members about how to go about being on or leading or building a board.
Well, let's dive into one of the topics in there that I'm sure is covered about, say, assembling the right people. And there's 2 different perspectives on it, right? So many of the people listening to the show are either aspiring board members, either first time or they've got one, now they want to build a portfolio. But you also have people on the other side. You've got the chairman of the board or the chairman of the NomGov, and they're trying to find the right people to put around the table. And so both sides need to learn how the process works and how to do it in the right way. And it's also incumbent upon us to always consider the other person's perspective as they're going through it. So talk about the assembling the right people and what we should all know about that.
In 2 minutes or less, right? The first, you can sort of break it down very broadly into 2 things. One is you want someone who's just going to be a good board member, right? You want someone who has, the attributes of being a successful director of a company. And there's a very long list of those, from, people who are prepared. People have to have a point of view. They have to be able to speak their mind. They have to not speak to hear the sound of their own voice. They have to have varied input. They have to hold you accountable. They have to build connections and relationships. It's a super long list of, sort of attributes of good board member. Actually, I'd say there are three things. The second thing is from the perspective of the company, they have to figure out what they're looking for in a board, in a particular board member. So, what we counsel our clients to think about is, think about four different types of experience, and think about which ones are missing from your board, and or which ones are missing from your leadership team, and how to get as many of those as possible in the director you're trying to hire. So the four vectors of experience are industry, which is kind of the one people start with. But we also ask them to consider what function the person is from. Do you want a CEO on your board? Do you want a CFO on your board? Do you want someone who's a front of the house executive, someone who has run sales or marketing or customer success or business development? Do you want a head of HR? Do you want a product leader, a technologist? So industry is one thing. Function is another thing. The third thing is customer type experience. So do you want someone who knows enterprise customers and enterprise selling? Do you want someone who knows a consumer type business? Do you want someone who knows a business that serves government or educators or small businesses? And then finally, the fourth type of experience, which is particularly important for high growth startups, is stage experience and stage transition experience. So, if you're working on getting a company public over the next 24 months, you probably want to hire someone that's taken a company public or been a public company director. If you got a raw startup and you're hiring your first independent director, you want someone that understands startups. So those are, sort of those four vectors. So the first thing is sort of attributes of a good board member. The second thing is what type of experience you bring to the table. And then the third thing is you want to have someone who's board ready. And this is actually a very important topic, especially as you get into thinking about diversity on boards. You don't necessarily need to hire someone who has been a board member. If you have as a requirement that the person has to have been a corporate board member before, you're instantly limiting the population of people who can get into your funnel to, for the most part, people who are CEOs or have been CEOs. Most of them are white. Most of them are male. There's nothing wrong with that. Those people are, typically very well qualified to take a board seat. It's just a limited population by dint of the way the world has worked over the last, 50 years. But we try to help our clients understand who in their target universe might be board ready without having been corporate board experienced. So, for example, you've served on a nonprofit board, or you've served on a community board. For example, you've been on a corporate advisory board, or you've been a mentor or advisor in a structured program like Techstars or Y Combinator. For example, you've been to board training or director's college somewhere. Any combination of those things. One of the biggest things we look for is someone who's just been on an executive team at a startup or growth stage company, and they've been in the boardroom. They present to the board every quarter for years. So board ready can mean lots of different things, but it doesn't have to mean have served on a corporate board.
So that makes a lot of sense. And in many ways, I'm imagining Jim Collins' book, Good to Great here, right? So you're talking about assembling the right people, getting them on the bus, right? So you've got the team on the bus. Then you got to build a team, right? And you got to figure out the social dynamics. And they talk about putting them in the right seats on the bus, right? Basically that spot. How do you go about helping an organization do that with their board?
We don't tend to do a lot of board effectiveness work, although I certainly help coach and advise CEOs and clients informally about that. But the first thing, and it comes back to to some of Jim Collins' writing, is CEOs need to think of their board as a team. And I've always thought of my job as CEO as leading two teams, leading my executive team and leading my board. And if you're a CEO and you think of your board as an annoyance or as the governing body, to whom you report, and you've got to show up, 4 times a year, 6 times a year, 12 times a year with materials for them, then then you have a more transactional relationship with them, potentially a more contentious relationship with them. If you think of your board as a team, and you treat the team the way you treat your leadership team, right, where you have to tend that team like a garden, right? You have to make sure the right people are in it, the wrong people get out of it. You have to worry about the social dynamic. You have to make sure that the team is building great connections in and across itself. The team is building connections to the rest of the company. The team is building connections outside the company within the industry. You just start to behave differently about how you run it, how you spend time with it, and what kinds of things you ask of it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And if we almost draw back to the experiences we talked about that you've had before as well, when you think about the learning curve that you've gone up personally, and I'm sure some of this ties into the coaching that you're doing as part of Bolster and helping organizations. So you've probably experienced, you've also been the chair of many of these boards, right? It's I think the way you described it is you got to eat what you put in front of them, right? So what does that look and feel like?
Well, boards. So this is an expression that I got from a longtime independent board member of mine at Return Path, a guy named Scott Weiss, who's a tremendous director. And what he said was, boards always eat what you put in front of them. And he's right. If you want the board to focus on something, you need to give them something that indicates they need to focus on it. You can put a 100-page binder in front of board members and say, these are the materials for next Tuesday's meeting. But that doesn't do much to shape the conversation. And in the absence of you shaping the conversation, the board will come in and shape the conversation for you. So, for example, when I do my board materials, I have a lot of what I would call backward-looking materials, right? So you have a board meeting after the quarter's over. You have a whole bunch of reporting about what happened last quarter. And it's really useful to highlight 3 or 4 things that they need to pay attention to in the many, many pages of metrics and dashboards and financial reports and whatever you have to them about the quarter. But if you leave those many pages, sort of as reports, people will come in having circled whatever they want and ask you random questions. So really steering that conversation about, now, here are 3 things about last quarter that I think you need to understand.
Right.
And then usually the much smaller part of the materials that you send out ahead of time are the forward-looking things, right? By definition, it hasn't happened yet. But that's where I find the most interesting and impactful board conversations to be. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out, as an executive team before a board meeting, okay, what do we want their help on? And for anything we want their help on, we need to structure some advanced reading that is pretty succinct and that asks some specific and probing questions. And we need to make sure they have enough time to read that and digest it before the meeting. And then when we're in the meeting, we say, okay, look, 3/4 of the materials may have been backward-looking, and a quarter may be strategic or forward-looking. But the meeting is going to be the reverse. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking backwards and giving you some highlights and answering a couple questions. Then we're going to spend the preponderance of the time talking about these few memos or position papers we put together with some thinking that we want you to do.
Which makes so much sense, right? The board member feels more engaged and useful if they've actually been helped to, in their area of expertise, think about the future as opposed to walking away saying, I never got to dig into the details. Whereas, maybe there's some lessons learned from the past, but we shouldn't spend all our time there. I know I love it when either the chair of the board or the CEO sends out a note, say a week in advance, saying, here are the 3 things that we're struggling with. We want your input. Think about these. Be ready to talk about them. You do have to lead the horse to water if you want it to drink what you need it to. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I'd also love your thoughts about managing conflict, right? Because you're talking about a group of people that doesn't meet all that often, but has really important work to do. And even if you try your best during the hiring process to get the right people who's going to be the right fit, there are conflicts that are going to arise. How do you go about handling those in a boardroom space?
Yeah, that's tricky because frequently boards are full of people who have big egos or at least have big experience sets. And have very strong opinions rooted in those experience sets, right? You get venture capitalists on your board; they've served on hundreds of boards, right? They have seen they've seen the movie before, and hopefully you can manage the social dynamic of a group so that there's not a lot of clashing in the boardroom, but that people are respectful and listen to each other. But you whether you're the chairman of a board or just the CEO and you have a lead independent director or a separate chairman, I think of the board as your team and the board as your board meeting as your meeting to run. And if you see conflict, you have to diffuse it the same way you would diffuse conflict on your executive team, starting with, turning down the temperature in the room, calling a break, doing active facilitation of the meeting. So Sally, what I hear you saying is blah, 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 and what I hear George saying is blah, blah, blah. Let's look at those two statements together and talk through them. Or let's do breakout groups, or let's take 15 minutes off.
Well, in some ways, it sounds like high school, but work can be like that, right? So we always have to figure out how to get to the right solution. That is the importance of the facilitator is leading around the table. And, Matt, as you have this discussion today, my mind is coming back to Bolster and what you're doing. And partly that's helping connect the opportunities for people who want to be in a board and bring a skill set and people who need to put people on the board. Clearly, the larger opportunity is also in the executive space. And I wonder if we could compare one element of that. The world has changed a lot because of COVID. Work from home, virtual work, remote work is becoming much more common in the workplace, even in the executive suite to many extents, and perhaps startups more than other established businesses. The boardroom space has reluctantly gone maybe like 95% remote during COVID, and many board members want to come back in person. Some might do a hybrid, maybe 1/4 in person, 1/4 remote, but it can be a very different experience. But there is a push to say, well, the board shouldn't go back to exactly the way it was before. We should grow and develop differently. When you sort of pull out your crystal ball and you think about the future of the boardroom, and as you're starting to talk to different talent and help organizations realize what they do and don't need, maybe you don't need people to come to the meeting. They can be somewhere else in the world and still participate virtually. What are your thoughts about how all of this is going to come together and the future of the boardroom might look like?
It's a great question, and it is, of course, more unknown than known. I think I think one of the things that COVID taught everyone is you don't actually have to be in person to have an effective meeting. And in particular, I think what's going to be a big driver of private company board activity going forward starts with venture capitalists. So venture capitalists are constrained by how many boards they sit on. Right? They can make more money, and their job is to make money if they have more investments and sit on more boards. And I think one of the things that venture capitalists realized over the last 2.5 years is they don't have to be in person for every board meeting. Therefore, they can actually be on more boards. Right? When you're in the world of, and I got to fly to New York for that board meeting, and I got to fly to San Francisco for that board meeting, and what about the one that's in Tokyo? You have a lot of constraints on your schedule. And the minute that evaporated, all of a sudden, I think the average VC said, I could do 12 boards. I don't have to do 8 boards. So I don't think the in-person board meeting is dead, but I don't think we're ever going to go back to a world where every board meeting is in person, unless you have a quirky board where every single person's in the same city. And even then, I'm not sure you're going to go back to every meeting being in person. So I think boards are going to have to settle into a pattern of, I would say a minimum of 1 in-person board meeting a year and maybe 2. But it may change the rhythm of board meetings. It may be that, hey, the in-person ones are half a day instead of every board meeting being 4 hours. The in-person ones are half a day or even a full day. And then there's some quick check-ins on Zoom in between. And all that's going to change how boards work. It's going to change how CEOs and board chairs manage the dynamics and social dynamics. And there's actually a lot of things you can do on Zoom to mimic what you do in the real world to maintain some of those things. You just have to be intentional about it.
Well, Matt, speaking of being intentional, I love what you're doing at Bolster and how you guys are really trying to move the needle and helping connect the right people with the right opportunities, no matter what their background or network might look like today. And in the same way, your third book coming out, The Startup Boards, June 15th, clearly a great opportunity for people to be picking up and learning and digesting some of the various topics that we talk about regularly in the show and be able to go in more depth on it. So we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Matt Blumberg. We got great insights about his upcoming books, June 15th, the Startup Boards, and a lot of the content and background you could hear coming out in the show today. But of course, we want to help you know about Bolster, which is the organization that he founded, which is really helping connect opportunity in the marketplace. He talked about supply and demand meeting, and board members, potential board members, their supply and the demand of the organizations that need them on their board. So head over and check that out. If you go over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to all of these things that we just talked about and we discussed in the show today. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to Boardroom Bound.